All right, welcome back, everyone. We're happy to bring up Paul Frambot from Morpho Labs, and he'll speak about basically Morpho, which is a new gateway to decentralized lending. So thanks, Paul.
Great. So hi, everyone, and thanks for joining. So today I'm going to present Morpho, and it's a new kind of lending protocol. And you'll learn how, as a user of Aave or Compound or any other lending protocol, you'll be able to earn better rates or pay less on your borrowing thanks to Morpho. So first, I wanted to go back on a point which is rather generic, but is how and why DeFi is supposed to, in the end, replace traditional finance. So there are 44,000 banks and credit unions around the world, right? And they all do the same thing, right? So you have 44,000 times the same algorithms, the same security audits made on the same algorithm, but isolated. So if you look at DeFi, you have like one algorithm for each DeFi primitive. So you get the intuition that it's the costs are reduced by 44,000 theoretically. So you have the intuition that DeFi economically makes a ton of sense. And in the long run, if we try to, we succeed in reproducing the efficiency of traditional finance in the blockchain, well, inevitably, it will thrive. So if you take DEXs, for example, so you have Uniswap, in particular Uniswap v3, that has reached really interesting levels of efficiencies those last months. And they even published a report recently where they explain that the depth of the DEXs of Uniswap is being kind of starting to beat the Binance or Kraken or centralized exchange at the moment. So that's very interesting to see that DEXs have reached mechanism designs that are competitive with traditional finance. And people won't go to DeFi instead of CeFi because it's not only because it's decentralized, but also because it's economically more efficient than traditional finance. And then you look at lending. So you have Aave, Compound, and you look at the rates, and you might say, hey, we're not so close to traditional finance rate, right? So this morning, it was 0.24% to lend USDC on Aave. And well, this is not what you expect from the next finance revolution, right? You expect higher yields. DeFi used to have much higher yields, but when you think about it, it was mostly due to token incentive, basically incentivizing people to borrow, and then this borrowing demand is creating yield for lenders. But yield is going down a little bit because token prices are going down, and protocols like Aave and Compound are cutting their emissions. And if you look at Compound, for example, this morning, again, you have this huge spread between the lending side and the borrowing side. So you have lending APY that are very low, and borrowing APY that are quite high, actually. So just look at Ether, you have like this 4% spreads. It's not even a fee. We'll talk about it later. So DEXs are on their way to disrupt traditional finance. They're reaching level of efficiency that are very interesting to the point where people start using Uniswap because it's better than Binance. But lending pools is still a very inefficient model at the moment. So the purpose of this talk is really to understand why is that and what can we do about it with Morpho. So let's take a step back on lending in general in DeFi and look at the very first models that were introduced for lending. So in the early days, really, you had those peer-to-peer models. Some of you may recognize this logo, which was the logo of Eastland, so the ancestor of Aave. But you had also Dharma, for example. And the idea was really, there is no lending pool, no such thing as a lending pool. Instead, you have a book, right, where people post the lending offers, and the borrowers come and basically take those offers. So as a lender, I'm going to propose, let's say, 10,000 USDC at a 2% APY. And then I have to wait until a borrower actually comes in, deposits some collateral, and is going to take this offer. So the sort of advantages of such model is basically that you have everything that you lend, if you are taken by a borrower, is going to be borrowed. Okay. And this model is obviously directly inspired by traditional finance. So those are the algorithms of traditional finance. They were good. Why not changing? So this is what was initially thought in 2017. But obviously, you have mainly two big problems with that. The first problem is, as you might have understood, the experience is very illiquid. It means that as a lender, you're posting some money, but you have to wait for a borrower to actually come and take that offer in order to generate yields. So in practice, in Iceland, for example, you would wait for ages before actually getting matched. And the second disadvantage is basically that it was gas intensive. So as a borrower, if I want to borrow large amounts, then I have to iterate through every single position that there is on Iceland. So borrow the first offer, then the second, then the third. And blockchain is not such a scalable environment. So gas-wise, it was not so efficient. So if you were to put Iceland or those peer-to-peer models, well, they were very capital efficient because, again, everything that you lent was borrowed. So capital efficiency-wise, it was good. But it was very illiquid. So users would not earn yield as soon as they deposit, which is an important property of DeFi yield mechanisms. So a few years later, actually a few months later, the Compound Labs team came up with a completely new design, which was the lending pool design. So the idea is quite simple, and actually much more simple than the book of peer-to-peer model, is basically that you have a big pool of liquidity, which is a smart contract, and anyone can supply liquidity into it. So if you want to provide liquidity to Compound, you just provide liquidity to the pool. And as a borrower, if you want to borrow liquidity, you just take that liquidity from the pool and pay interest into it. And the very nice properties that this mechanism has brought is basically that users can withdraw at any time, borrow at any time, and any amount. So let me explain. I'm depositing tokens in the Compound lending pool. Instantly, the block after, I'm generating yield because there are active borrowers in this lending pool. And you have this very nice property of, since I'm not matched peer-to-peer, it's a pool, if there is liquidity in the pool, then I can withdraw. The downside is the interests that are paid by the borrowers are going to be shared across all the pool. It means that just a small portion of my capital is going to be utilized. So as a lender, I'm depositing into the pool, but only, let's say, like 25% of my capital is going to be borrowed. And this is what is creating the large APY spreads that we just talked about earlier. And this spread, if you wonder what it's caused by, it's not a fee taken by Compound. Like, Compound is not taking a 3% fee on ETH. Basically, it's just the pool model, where you have many, many suppliers and very few borrowers. And lenders, so the guys earning 0.39%, are sharing the interests paid by the few borrowers. So there are a few borrowers paying a lot, and those interests are shared across all the lenders. So you kind of get the idea that this model is not so capital efficient. So if we were to place Aave and Compound in the same graph, you could say that they are very liquid. That's very nice, because you can withdraw when you want. OK, that's desirable. But they're not capital efficient. You get this 0.24% yield on USDC. OK, not so interesting compared to traditional finance. Now Morpho. Well, Morpho is a protocol that is exactly the same as Compound or Aave from a user perspective. So if you use Morpho, it's like you're using Compound. You supply liquidity, you borrow assets, exactly the same way. You have the same interface, and actually, you have the same liquidity available. So there is one Morpho protocol for each lending pool. So there is Morpho Compound for Compound, Morpho Aave for Aave, and Morpho lending pool for whatever lending pool that exists. And through Morpho Compound, for example, you have the same liquidity available than on Compound, because Morpho Compound taps directly into Compound. So Morpho Compound has the same liquidity, so it means billions of liquidity available, but it also means the same parameters. So just before we had a talk about risk, well, Morpho is going to copy on-chain the risk parameters of Compound, if it's Morpho Compound. Or Morpho Aave is going to have the same collateral factors as Aave, the same oracles. Well, so far, everything is the same, except that we have, with Morpho, much better rates. And this is true for both sides of the market. So lenders are going to earn much more, and borrowers are going to pay much less. So if you wanted to position Morpho in this graph, well, you're as liquid as Compound and Aave, and you're as efficient as a peer-to-peer model. So how does it work in practice? Well, let's take a user journey. So let's say you want to lend some capital. So I have some ETH, and I want to lend it to Morpho. So Morpho is going to put it to the lending pool. So let's say Aave, for example. And then a borrower comes in. And so he's going to deposit some collateral in order to borrow. So that's step 4. And it triggers the borrow button. And by triggering the borrow button, Morpho is going to extract the liquidity that was deposited by the lender at the first step, so extract it from the pool and give it directly to the borrower. So what's happening here is that the borrower and the lender are out of the pool. They are matched peer-to-peer. Here, really, the borrower and the lenders, since they're out of the pool, they don't have to share the interests with the rest of the pool. So there isn't this spread that we were mentioning in the beginning. So if you take an example with this image, you have like the spread of Compound, let's say. So low lending APY and very high borrowing APY. Then Morpho has an APY which is in the middle. And this APY is the same for lenders and borrowers. So the idea is the following. So if I am the very first user on Morpho, well, Morpho is going to put me on Compound. So I'm going to experience the rates that is low. Okay. And then a borrower is going to come in, and Morpho is going to extract me out of the pool in order to be matched at this mid-rate, which is more interesting for me, but also more interesting for the borrower, because the borrower is not going to take this 2.5%. It's going to have like this 1.2. And then you may ask, OK, I'm lending my money to a borrower. Isn't there like counterparty risk or something like that? I can't exit my liquidity because it's in the hands of the borrower. Well, Morpho cleverly invented a mechanism to actually fall back in the underlying pool whenever needed. That means that if you want to withdraw your liquidity, but the liquidity is taken for the borrower, well, Morpho is simply going to put the borrower back on Compound, so that the lender can exit at any time. So with this, you kind of get the intuition that with Morpho, you get, in the worst-case scenario, the exact same thing that you got on Compound. So Morpho Compound, worst-case scenario, Compound. Average-case scenario, you get the mid-rate. So it's strictly better. Same for Aave. Morpho Aave is going to be an improvement of Aave. So we did a white paper describing the vision of the protocol, and I would encourage anyone that is interested in Morpho to read this paper. Just posted the link here if you're interested. And maybe just doing a quick recap so that everybody understands well what Morpho is about. It's really as simple as that. If you're an Aave user, well, basically, you're not having good efficiency. You're not having good capital efficiency. And Morpho Aave solve that problem. So if you're an Aave user, if you move to Morpho Aave, you have the same liquidity, the same liquidation parameters, but you have better rates. Same for Morpho Compound with Compound, et cetera, et cetera. And actually, what we've seen is that Morpho was launched 2 months ago. And in less than 2 months, the protocol started at obviously $0 and is now at 130 million supplied through the protocol. And when you look at the users of Morpho, you have many users that actually switch from Compound to go to Morpho Compound, or from Aave to Morpho Aave, because they understood that they would be strictly better. Right, here we are. So here is the website to Morpho, and also we're hiring, so if you're interested in joining the team. The protocol is quite interesting and complex to grasp, so if you're a good technical person, we're happy would be happy to be working with you, but we're also recruiting in many jobs, like, for example, marketing and content. So feel free just to ping us after this talk or directly through the link. And obviously, if you have questions, then I'd be happy to answer them. Yeah, I see one there.
So, sorry if I did not understand the Morpho solution. If the first lender that comes to Morpho goes to Compound, right? And then with the first borrower that asks for the same amount of capital, it gets extracted and they get matched with the middle point, right? But if more and more borrowers go to Morpho instead of Compound because it's strictly better for them, less borrowers will go to Compound, and Compound will have lower APYs because they have way lower utilization. So in the end, if Morpho is not changing the borrowing market, it will extract fee capabilities from Compound or Aave, which are uniformized across all users, and instead some few lenders from Morpho, the first lenders in Morpho, will get way better rates. The borrowers in Morpho will get way better rates, and all the other lenders will get much lower rates.
So yeah, so that's a very interesting point. So if you assume that there is a fixed number of borrowers and that they come from Compound and they move to Morpho Compound, then you have two effects. So those users are going to improve their rates, at least they will be better than on Compound, and your rate is going to lower the utilization rate of Compound. And since rates are fixed according to utilization rate, it may lower the interest rates. Okay. So it's even better for borrowers, by the way. But anyway. And so 2 points to this. So the first point is, well, first you have other borrowers than those coming from Compound, and basically enabling a rate that is in the middle may enable new use cases that were not done before because this race did not happen. So what can happen is that you have more borrowers. It's not a fixed number of borrowers. Like having a new interest rate that is lower is going to unlock new use cases, so more borrowers, so bigger utilization rates overall. So that's the first point. And the second point is that in the Morpho protocol, you have this mid-rate. And I kind of oversimplified this a little bit. So at the moment, the rate is set to be in the middle. But this formula in the code is upgradable by governance. And you could imagine that if at some point the lending pool are providing so low interest rates that Morpho move away from this model. And it was designed in such a way that the protocol can become more and more independent from the rate model of Aave and Compound, if that's clear. So just for the little story, Morpho is a blue butterfly. And you start as a caterpillar living in an apple, and progressively, you start to become independent. And this is what we envision, and you tackle exactly one of the points that we're very interested in. Is Morpho is really better than Compound. So if I'm a Compound user, if I'm rational, I will move. But then Morpho at some point will take its own independence in order to have a free market of rates rather than being constrained by the rates of the pool that are not determined by the markets. They're determined by an arbitrary model, right? So yeah, I hope that answers the question a little bit.
Sure, thank you. I just think maybe it's like a bit like the prisoner dilemma. If all the Compound users move to Morpho, Morpho also ceases to exist. But,
Sorry?
Okay, thank you. Yes, if every user, if every lender and borrower moves from Compound moves to Morpho, how come Morpho continued to work?
It will. So as you mentioned, you'll have a part of the users that are matched peer-to-peer, experiencing a rate, and the other that are going to be left on Compound, where the rate could be potentially a bit lower. It will be lower in any case.
OK, thank you.
Any other questions? Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul.